No longer three news anchors who are called the voice of God, literally, they used to be called the voice of God, telling you what you have to believe, and no one can dissent. Now we have a much more wide open environment, many more sources of information for you to filter through. And
see the rest of this at cspan.org. We'll leave it now as the U.S. Senate is gaveling in for the afternoon. Senators returning to debate immigration legislation. Votes on amendments at 3 p.m. Eastern today.
Madam President, I come to the floor today to ask my colleagues to join us in supporting the historic comprehensive immigration bill that is before the Senate. We worked hard on the Judiciary Committee, Madam President, to craft a strong bipartisan bill that bolsters our economy, secures our borders, and promotes opportunities for both businesses and families. I thank all of those involved in the original bill, Senators Schumer, McCain, Durbin, Graham, Menendez, Rubio, Bennett, and Flake, and I thank the members of the Judiciary Committee who all had a hand in changes to the bill. And I specifically want to thank Senator Hatch, who worked with me on the I-Squared, the Immigration Innovation Bill. The bill on the floor today contains many of the provisions from our I-Squared bill that encourage more American innovation. As you know, we passed this comprehensive immigration bill out of the Judiciary Committee on a bipartisan vote of 13-5, and I'm hopeful we can build on that kind of broad-based support on the Senate floor as we saw when we began this debate. This isn't going to be simple. It isn't going to be easy, but the most important thing, the reason I'm optimistic we can get something done, is the fact that we are all coming at this from the same basic starting point. Democrats and Republicans, senators from border states and senators from inland states, we can all agree on this. Our current immigration system is broken and changes must be made. The question now is how those changes should come about, and that's why we're having this debate, to find that common ground and pass a bill that is ultimately stronger because it reflects the needs and priorities of both parties in all regions of the country. Passing comprehensive immigration reform will be a vital step forward for our country. It will be vital to our immigrant communities who have been separated from their families for too long. It will be vital to our security, and it will be vital to our economy to strengthen the workforce, addressing our long-term fiscal challenges and promoting innovation. There are many strong and compelling arguments for immigration reform, but let me begin with the economic impact on our businesses and major industries. Minnesota is a big agriculture state, just like the state of Wisconsin, Madam President, and I can't tell you how many farmers and agricultural businesses I've heard from who tell me they rely on migrant workers and other immigrants to keep their operations going. I've heard it from high-tech startups, too, as well as big technology companies like 3M, St. Jude, Medtronic. I've heard it from the home builders and the construction companies, even hospitals and healthcare providers. These businesses represent a vast range of industries and interests, but when it comes to immigration reform, they all agree. It's critical to their operations, and it is a vital engine for growth and innovation. And in fact, history shows that immigrants have helped America lead the world in innovation and entrepreneurship for generations. Madam President, more than 30% of U.S. Nobel laureates were born in other countries. 90 of our Fortune 500 companies were formed by immigrants. 200 of our Fortune 500 companies were formed by immigrants or children of immigrants. Workers, inventors, scientists, researchers from around the world have literally built America. And in an increasingly global economy, they are a big part of keeping our country competitive today. If we want to continue to be a country that thinks, that invents, that exports to the world, then we can't afford to shut out the world's talent. It doesn't make sense to educate tomorrow's inventors in our colleges and our universities and then send them back to their other country so they can start the next Google in India or in France. That's why I introduced the I-Squared Act with Senator Hatch to make much-needed reforms to allow engineers and scientists to come into our country. One of the things that the bill would do is to increase fees on employment-based green cards so that we can also reinvest in our own homegrown innovation pipeline. The idea here is that when companies get a green card, that part of that funding will be used for our schools, for science, technology, engineering, and math classes so we can educate our own students right here in America. My state, Madam President, the unemployment rate is now at 5.4%. We actually have job openings for engineers. We have job openings for welders. And we would like those jobs to be filled from kids that go to the University of Minnesota. We would like those jobs to be filled by kids that get a degree at a tech school in Minnesota. But right now when we have openings, we have to do a combination of things. We have to be educating our own kids, and we have to be making sure that if there's a doctor who comes from another country, is willing to study at the University of Minnesota or in Rochester, Minnesota, and then wants to do his or her residency right in America, in an underserved area, in a place like inner-city Minneapolis or a place like Thief River Falls, Minnesota, that we let them do that internship, that residency there, instead of send them packing to their own country. Much of the legislation that was in the I-squared bill, as I mentioned, is included right here in the bill we're considering. The health care leaders provision that I mentioned, originally called the Conrad 30 bill, something that I worked on with Senator Heitkamp and Senator Moran and others, that is also in this bill. Here's something else that just makes good sense. Bringing the roughly 11 million undocumented workers out of the shadows. Immigrants who are off the grid can't demand fair pay or benefits, and there are those who seek to take advantage of that. It's a bad thing for American workers whose wages are undercut, and it's a bad thing for American families whose undocumented relatives are being exploited. In addition to the economic implications, having millions of undocumented people living in our country poses a serious threat to both national security and public safety. The bill takes the only rational and feasible approach to bringing these people out of the shadows by creating a fair, tough, and accountable path to citizenship for those who have entered the country illegally or overstayed their visas. It's not an easy path. You have to pay fines. You have to stay employed. You have to pass a background check. You go to the back of the line. You learn English. And you wait for at least 13 years to become a citizen. And if you've committed a felony or 3 misdemeanors, you're not eligible. Then you have to go back to your home country. Keep in mind, none of these steps towards citizenship would even begin until we've done what is necessary to secure our borders. This bill immediately appropriates $4.5 billion towards adding more Border Patrol agents, more fencing, and more technologies like aerial surveillance to prevent illegal crossings over the southern border. That's money that is being committed today, not a promise for future spending or something dependent on future Congresses. That money will be spent to make our border more secure. I think it's also important to recognize that these new efforts would come on top of the progress we've already made in recent years. Some estimates show that net illegal migration over the Mexican border is actually negative, meaning more people are going back or being sent back to Mexico than are coming here illegally. We have seen a sea change over the last few years, and part of it, of course, is because of enforcement efforts that are going on, many of them funded by this Congress. But preventing illegal immigration isn't just about stopping people at the border. It's also about removing the incentive for people to come here illegally in the first place. The way we do that is by requiring employers to start using the E-Verify system so they can check whether or not a person is authorized to work in this country. It's that simple. And to ensure the smoothest possible transition, as we know there have been some issues with the E-Verify system in the past, we do it over a 5-year phase-in period based on the size and the type of the company. So smaller companies, farmers, those that will be harder to get to use the system, they go later. I believe our compromise on the workplace enforcement issue is a good one, and it's reflective of the bipartisan balanced approach that this bill takes overall on so many other complex issues. The economic and security arguments for reform are compelling, Madam President, but we know there is so much more to do. This is about maintaining America's role as a beacon for hope and justice in the world, particularly for those seeking refuge and asylum. This is something we know a lot about in Minnesota, where we have always opened our arms to people fleeing violence in their home countries. Minnesota is home to the largest Somali population in North America and the second largest Hmong population in the United States. We are proud of the work that these people have done. We actually had the first Hmong woman legislator in the United States, Mimua, and we believe we are better off because of the incredible diversity and entrepreneurial spirit people have brought to our state from other countries. Just as we have granted asylum to those fleeing violence in other countries, we must also look after those who flee violence here at home. That's why I feel so strongly about the need to ensure immigrant victims of domestic violence are not forced to suffer in silence. The bill we are considering includes 2 amendments I introduced in the Judiciary Committee that would protect immigrants who are victims of domestic violence and elder abuse. No person who is being abused should be forced to live in fear because they're worried they'll lose their immigration status if they speak up. Children shouldn't be forced to live in fear either. So we need to change our laws to ensure families aren't being torn apart by a system that is not only inefficient but expensive and cruel. 64,000 immigrant parents were separated from their citizen children during the first 6 months of 2012 as a result of deportation. So this bill is about protecting families. It's also about building families. If I could say one thing about the domestic abuse issue, I can't tell you how many cases we had when I was prosecutor where, in fact, a case would come into the office and the victim would be an immigrant. And the perpetrator, we would have found, was threatening to get her deported or get her mother deported if she was illegal, or get her sister deported or a family member deported if she reported it to the police. This bill fixes a lot of that with the way it handles the U-Visa program, as well as a number of the amendments that I included, and it makes it easier to prosecute these perpetrators. As I mentioned, this bill is also about building families. Minnesota leads the country in international adoptions, and I've seen the incredible joy an adopted child from another country can bring to a new mom or dad. That's why I've introduced with Senator Coates and Senator Landrieu a series of amendments to improve our system for international adoptions so that more children can find a loving home here in the United States. Madam President, this bill is vital to our economy and to our national security. But most importantly, it is vital to maintaining America's remarkable heritage as a nation of immigrants. I myself here because of Slovenian and Swiss immigrants. You know a little bit about Swiss immigrants in Wisconsin. My grandpa on my dad's side worked 1,500 feet underground in the iron ore mines of Ely, Minnesota. His family came to northern Minnesota in search of work, and the iron ore mines and forests of northern Minnesota seemed the closest thing to home in Slovenia. My grandpa never graduated from high school, and he saved money in a coffee can to send my dad to college. My dad earned a journalism degree from the University of Minnesota after getting a community college degree in northern Minnesota at Vermilion Community College. He was a newspaper reporter and a longtime columnist for the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. My mom was a teacher, and she taught second grade until she was 70 years old. Her parents came from Switzerland to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where my great-grandma ran, guess what, a cheese shop. The Depression was hard on their family, and out of work for several years, my grandpa actually made and sold miniature Swiss chalets made out of teeny pieces of wood. So I stand here today on the shoulders of immigrants, the granddaughter and great-granddaughter of iron ore miners and cheesemakers and craftsmen, the daughter of a teacher and a newspaper man, and the first woman elected to the United States Senate from the state of Minnesota. It could not have been possible in a country that didn't believe in hard work, fair play, and the promise of opportunity for people from other countries. It would not have been possible in a country that didn't open its arms to the risk takers, to the pilgrims, and to the pioneers of this world. So this is a very special and enduring part of American history, and we need to make sure it continues for future generations in a way that is fair, that is efficient, and that is legal. Passing this bill is important to our economy. It's important to our global competitiveness. It's important to our national security. But it's also important to millions of people who are here right now in the United States of America and others that want to come here and live that dream that my grandparents and my great-grandparents lived. This is too important for us not to act. To my colleagues, join us in passing this bill. Let's get it done. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
Who yields time.
President, I note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Madam President,
The senator from Hawaii.
I ask unanimous consent that we vitiate the quorum call.
Without objection.
Madam President, I believe that we must fix the immigration bill to make it fairer for women. The bill proposes a new merit-based point system for allocating green cards for future immigrants. Simply put, the point system makes it harder for women than for men to come to this country. The theory behind the merit system is that we should give immigration preferences to people who hold advanced degrees or work in high-skilled jobs. This idea ignores the discrimination women endure in other countries. Too many women overseas do not have the same educational or career advancement opportunities available to men in those countries. In practice, the bill's new point system takes that inequitable treatment abroad and cements it into our immigration laws. This bill reduces the opportunities for immigrants to come under the family-based green card system. Currently, approximately 70% of immigrant women come to this country through the family-based system. But this legislation increases the amount of employment-based visas. So this bill basically moves us away from the family-based system and into economic considerations. Nothing wrong with that, but we should be fair to women while we're doing it. The immigration avenues that favor men over women by nearly a 4-to-1 margin. Using the past as our guide, it's easy to see how the new merit-based system with heavy emphasis on factors like education and experience will disadvantage women who apply for green card status. We all want a stronger economy, but we should not sacrifice the hard-won victories of the women's equality movement to get it. Ensuring that women have an equal opportunity to come here isn't an abstract policy cause to me. When I was a young girl, my mother brought my brothers and me to this country in order to escape an abusive marriage. My life would be completely different if my mother wasn't able to take on that courageous journey. I want women like her, women who don't have the opportunities to succeed in their own countries, to be able to build better lives for themselves here. These disparities in the immigration bill are fixable. Later this week, a number of my female Senate colleagues and I will introduce a proposal that would address the disparities in the new merit-based system. Let's improve immigration reform to make this bill better for women who deserve a fair shake in our green card system. I note the absence of a quorum, Madam President.
The clerk will call the roll.
Alexander.
A quorum call on the Senate floor as senators continue working on bipartisan immigration legislation again today. Majority Leader Harry Reid has said that he hopes to finish this bill before the July 4th recess. Lawmakers have been debating amendments to the measure this afternoon. Votes on some of those amendments expected at 3 today.
Without
the House.
objection.
Madam President, we'll be voting on some amendments coming up. I just want to share a few thoughts as we gather here in advance of that. And one of the comments made earlier by one of our good senators indicated a belief that this immigration bill is going to raise salaries of American workers. I think that was what was said. And I got to tell you, that's not accurate. It's a very, very serious issue that we're confronting here. I would say that this legislation does the opposite and creates an unprecedented flow of new workers into America, the likes of which we've not seen before, and you'll have a direct result of depressing job opportunities and wages of American citizens, people who are legally here as immigrants, who are also looking for work and need jobs. It will impact the wages of African Americans, Hispanics, and any other group in America. And this is the reason why. Under our current law, the legal flow of persons to America would be 1 million a year, the largest of any country in the world. Over 10 years, that would be 10 million. At this point, we now have 11 million here, and these plus a backlog of 5 million more will total about 15 million people would be legalized in very short order under this legislation. Some say, well, they're already working here, so there's not a problem on employment. But many of those workers are in the shadows. They're underemployed, maybe working part-time in restaurants and other places, and all of a sudden they'll be given legal status and they'll be able to apply to any job in America. So this will be good for them, but the question is it our duty here to give our first responsibility to those who've entered illegally, and don't we have a responsibility to consider how it will impact people that are unemployed today who are out looking for work? And we know that wages since '99 have dropped as much as 8–9%. Wages are declining, not going up in America today. And one of the big reasons, according to Professor Borjas at Harvard, is that the flow of labor from abroad creates an excess of labor, and that causes wages to decline. It's just a fact, and that's where that works. In addition to that, we have our current law that allows workers to come, temporary workers, guest workers, who come for a period of time, and then they can work. And so what happens to that flow of workers today? Well, they will double the number of people that will be coming in to do temporary workers, and you've got to understand they come many for 3 years with their family, and they can re-up for another 3 years, and they compete also for a limited number of jobs that legal immigrants would be competing for, as well as citizens would be competing for. So you have this bubble being accepted at once, the 15 million. You've got a doubling of the current flow, and then in addition to that, the annual immigrant flow into our country will increase at least 50%. It could be more than that. So that would go from 1 million a year to 1.5 million a year. So over 10 years, that's 15 million. So what we need to say is that in a country of 300 million people to whom we as elected officials owe our primary responsibility, under this legislation, if it were to pass, this 800,000 pages in this bill would allow 30 million people to be placed on a permanent path to citizenship over this 10-year period, well above what would normally be 10 million. And in addition to that, the flow of temporary guest workers, so-called, will be here, will be double what the current rate is. Not much time is left on this side, or I have. And
Senator, 17 minutes.
Well, I would ask to be notified and 5 minutes, if they would. Others may be declared. Senator Vitter, I believe his airplane has been delayed. His amendment is projected to come up. I don't know if the leader will call it up if he's not able to get back. But it is a really excellent amendment, and it deals with a fundamentally flawed part of our immigration system that the bill before us today makes worse, not better. It absolutely, indisputably does. This is the current situation. 6 times Congress in the last 10 or 15 years has passed legislation to require an entry-exit visa system. It's required that it be biometric. In other words, fingerprints or something like that, but normally fingerprints would be utilized. That's done when you come into the country. People are fingerprinted as they come into the country. It goes into the system, but we're not checking when anybody leaves. So people come legally on a visa, and then they leave, and nobody knows whether they left or not because we don't use the system when people exit. 40% of people now coming into the country illegally are coming through visa overstays. They get a legal visa, they come, they just don't leave. People don't even know if they left or not because they're not even clocked out. The 9/11 Commission said this is wrong. You need a biometric entry and exit system at land, sea, and airports. This bill, what does it do? It eliminates that language. It's already in law, been passed by Congress, and inexplicably never been carried out. And it says you just have a biographic or electronic system. It does not require a fingerprint-type entry-exit system. And not only that, it only requires it at air and sea ports, not the land ports. And the 9/11 Commission said that won't work because people come in all the time on air and they leave by land, and you can't rely on it, and it won't establish the right integrity to know whether somebody overstayed or not. That makes perfect sense. So Senator Vitter attempts to do that, and he would have an integrated biometric entry-exit system operating and functioning at every land, air, and seaport, not just air and sea, prior to the processing of any application for legal status pursuant to the original biometric exit law, the 2004 Intel Reform Act recommendations. This is what the current law says. And in addition, before the implementation of any program granting temporary legal status, the Department of Homeland Security Secretary must submit written certification of the deployment of the system, which will then be fast-tracked and approved through streamlined House and Senate procedures. This amendment is added to the current bill, and it will be effective in accomplishing what we need. In other words, it's got a little trigger here. It says you don't get your legal status until the government does what they've been directed to do by Congress for over 10 years and have just failed to do. And we have had a report done, a pilot project, that showed in Atlanta Airport, for example, that people go into the airport, they catch a plane back home to England or Jordan or India, wherever they go. They put their fingerprints on a machine. It reads them as they go on through into the airport. And what they found was that out of 27,000 people that in that pilot test, that 140 were on the hit list, the watch list, for terrorism, or warrants were out for their arrest, or other serious charges were against them. And they were able to identify them before they fled or left the country. And that's what the whole system was about. And they found it didn't slow down the airport. They found it didn't cost nearly what people are saying it is. Some have said it would be $25 billion. That's totally inaccurate. Will not cost anything like that, according to this report. Police officers have fingerprint reading machines in their automobiles. You just go by there and you put your fingers on there, it reads your print, and if you've got a warrant out for your arrest somewhere for murder, or drug dealing, or terrorism, You get apprehended. They recently caught a terrorist, actually from Alabama, prosecuted him in Alabama, who was trying to get on a plane in Atlanta.
The senator has consumed 5 minutes.
Madam Chair, I thank the chair would reserve the balance of my time and yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from Vermont.
Thank you, Madam President. Let me congratulate the Gang of Eight who have worked on this immigration bill so assiduously, Senator Pat Leahy, the chairman of the committee, for doing a lot of good work. And there is much in this bill that I support. I support the pathway to citizenship. I support the DREAM Act. I support providing legal status to foreign workers who are working in agriculture. We have to have strong border security, and I support that effort. But let me tell you what I do not support. What I do not support is that at a time when nearly 14% of Americans do not have a full-time job, at a time when youth unemployment is somewhere around 16%, and kids from California to Maine are desperately seeking employment, I do not support a huge expansion in the guest worker program that will allow hundreds of thousands of entry-level guest workers to come into this country. And this is important for at least 2 reasons. You have kids all over America who are wondering how they're going to afford to be able to go to college. And many of these young people are going out looking for summer jobs, looking for part-time jobs in order to help them pay for college. And that is terribly important. And we should not pass legislation which makes it harder for young people to get jobs in order to put away a few bucks to help pay for college. And then there's another group of people, and those are young people, Madam President, who we don't talk enough about. Not everybody in America is going to college. There are millions of young people who graduate high school who want to go out and start their careers and make some money and move up the ladder. There are others who have dropped out of high school. We cannot turn our backs on those young people. They need jobs as well. And if young people, young high school graduates, for example, are unable to find entry-level jobs, how will they ever be able to develop the skills, the experience, and the confidence they need to break into the job market? And if they don't get those skills, if they don't get those jobs and that income, there is a very strong possibility that they may end up in antisocial or self-destructive activities. Right now, in street corners all over this country, there are kids who have nothing to do. And what are they doing when they stand on street corners? What they are doing is getting into drugs, they're getting into crime, they're getting into self-destructive activity. We already have too many young people in this country using drugs. We already have too many young people involved in criminal activity. As a nation, we have more people in jail than any other country on earth, including China. Let us put our young people into jobs, not into jails. As I have heard on this floor time and time again, the best anti-poverty program is a paycheck. Well, let us give the young people of this country a paycheck. Let's put them to work. Let's give them at least the entry-level jobs they need in order to earn some income today, but even more importantly, let us allow them to gain the job skills they need so that they know what an honest day's work is about and can move up the economic ladder and get better jobs in the future. Madam President, at a time when poverty in this country remains at an almost 50-year high, and when unemployment among young people is extremely high, I worry deeply that we are creating a permanent underclass, a large number of people who are poorly educated and who have limited or no job skills. This is an issue that we must address and must address now. Either we make a serious effort to find jobs for our young people now, or we're going to pay later in terms of increased crime and the cost of incarceration. Now, why is this issue of youth unemployment relevant to the debate that we are having on immigration reform? And the answer is obvious to anyone who has read the bill. This legislation, this immigration reform legislation, increases youth unemployment by bringing into this country, through the J-1 program and the H-2B program, hundreds of thousands of low-skill, entry-level workers who are taking the jobs that young Americans need. At a time when youth unemployment in this country is over 16% and the teen unemployment rate is over 25%, many of the jobs that used to be done by young Americans are now being performed by foreign college students through the J-1 summer work travel program. Other entry-level foreign workers come into this country through the H-2B guest worker program. We have heard, Madam President, a lot of discussion about high-tech workers and how they can create jobs and all that. That is an issue for another discussion. Right now, what we are talking about is hundreds of thousands of foreign workers coming into this country not to do great scientific work, not as great entrepreneurs to start businesses, not as Ph.D. engineers, but as waiters and waitresses, kitchen help, lifeguards, front desk workers at hotels and resorts, ski instructors, cooks, chefs, chambermaids, landscapers, parking lot attendants, cashiers, security guards, and many other entry-level jobs. Does it really make sense to anyone when so many of our kids are desperately looking for a way to earn an honest living that we say to those kids, sorry, you've got to get to the back of the line because we're bringing in hundreds of thousands of foreign workers to do the jobs that you could do tomorrow? Madam President, the J-1 program for foreign college students is supposed to be used as a cultural exchange program, a program to bring young people into this country to learn about our customs and to support international cooperation and understanding. That is why it is administered by the State Department. And I would say to Senator Grassley, I will finish in a few moments and give the floor to you. But instead of doing that, this program has morphed, this J-1 program has morphed into a low-wage jobs program to allow corporations like McDonald's, Dunkin' Donuts, Disney World, Hershey's, many other major resorts around the country to replace young American workers with cheaper labor from overseas. Madam President, each and every year, companies from all over this country are hiring more than 100,000 foreign college students in low-wage jobs through the J-1 summer work travel program. Unlike other guest worker programs, the J-1 program does not even require businesses to recruit or advertise for American workers. What they can do is pay minimum wage. They don't have to advertise for American workers. And guess what? For the foreign workers, they do not have to pay Social Security tax. They don't have to pay Medicare tax. They don't have to pay unemployment tax. So essentially, we are creating a situation where it is absolutely advantageous for an employer to hire a foreign worker rather than an American worker. So, Madam President, what I have done is introduce two pieces of legislation to address this issue. Number one basically says that while I strongly support cultural programs, bring young people here from abroad, great idea, at this moment, with high unemployment, we cannot have those people competing with young Americans for a scarce number of jobs. So we eliminate the employment element of the J-1 program. And the second bill that I've said is that if we can't do that, and I hope we can, at the very least, we need a jobs program for American kids, not just a summer jobs program, but a year-long jobs program. Let us not turn our backs on kids who want to get into the labor market want to develop a career. They need something in the summertime. They need something year-long. And we have introduced legislation to do just that. Madam President, my time has expired, and I would yield the floor, if he wants it, to Senator Grassley.
The senator from Iowa.
Soon be voting on the Thune Amendment, and I rise to speak in support of the Thune Amendment. This amendment would strengthen the bill and beef up the triggers that precede the legalization program. Senator Thune's amendment would ensure that current law regarding double-layer fencing is implemented. Now, over the years, administration after administration, and that's not just the Democrat or just a Republican, but both, has failed to enforce the laws on the books. The American people don't want more laws that will simply be ignored. They want the laws on the books to be enforced. This amendment by Senator Thune would ensure that the border is more secure before any legalization program is carried out. In a new CNN poll released just today, 36% of those polls said that they favored a path to citizenship for people who have come to this country undocumented. But 62% of those polls said that it was more important to increase border security to reduce or eliminate the number of immigrants coming into the country without permission from our government. So if you stand with the American people, and if you want the border secured, you'll vote for the Thune Amendment. It's this simple, that when issues come up in my town meetings in my state of Iowa, and people are saying, well, what's going on with immigration? And you sit down and you try to explain to the people how this bill is moving along or what it might include. Invariably, there's a lot of people in the audience that said, we don't need more legislation. We need to have the laws on the books enforced. And I think this is backed up by this poll that we've had from CNN today. In addition to that, I think it clarifies very much that people want the laws on the books enforced, but more importantly, they would expect people that take an oath to uphold the Constitution and the laws would actually carry out the laws that they're elected to carry out. So I hope that you'll vote for the Thune Amendment. I yield the floor. Suggest the absence of a quorum. Are you going to talk? Do you want to talk? Suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Senators continuing their work on bipartisan immigration. The senators have been debating amendments. Majority Leader Harry Reid still saying that he hopes to finish this bill before the July 4th recess. Lawmakers are, again, debating amendments, and votes on those amendments are about to happen at 3 p.m. That's when they are expected to vote on at least a series of 4 amendments. Quick reminder that the House is also in session today. Members there are working on a bill that would ban abortions after 20 weeks of pregnancy. You can see the House live on C-SPAN and, of course, the Senate right here on C-SPAN, too.
The senator from Iowa.
I ask that the calling of the quorum be suspended.
Without objection. Under the previous order, the question occurs on amendment number 1197, offered by the senator from South Dakota, Mr. Thune. Is there a sufficient second? Yes. There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Beckich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Chiesa, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Cowan, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Mr. Ronow, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative, Coates and Grassley. Senators voting in the negative, Baldwin, Hirono, and Schatz. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Tester, no. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Roberts, aye. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Graham, no. Mr. Johans, aye. Mr. Casey, no. Mr. Heller, aye. Mr. Sanders, no. Franken. Mr. Franken, no. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Isaacson, aye. Mr. Donnelly, no. Mr. Manchin, aye. Stabenow, no. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Leahy, no. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Kane, no. Mr. Moran, aye. Mrs. Murray, no. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. McCain. Mr. McCain, no. Ms. Ayotte, aye. Mrs. Hagan, no. Mr. Rubio, no. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher? Aye. Mr. Whitehouse? No. Mr. Hatch? Aye. Mr. Paul? Aye. Mr. Lee? Aye. Mr. Vitter? Aye. Mr. Cruz? Aye. Mr. Cowan? No. Mrs. Gillibrand? No. Mr. Udall of New Mexico? No. Mr. Beckidge? No. Mr. Toomey? Mr. Toomey? Aye. Mr. Sessions? Aye. Mrs. Shaheen? No. Mr. Baucus? Mr. Baucus? Mr. Baucus? No. Mr. Merkley? No. Mr. Thune? Mr. Thune? Aye. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin? Aye. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota? No. Mr. Brown? No. Mr. Risch? Aye. Mr. Enzi? Aye. Mr. McConnell? Mr. McConnell? Aye. Ms. Heitkamp? No. Mr. Flake? No. Mr. Bozeman? Aye. Mr. Kirk? Aye. Ms. Klobuchar? No. Mr. Chiesa? Aye. Mr. Crapo? Aye. Mr. Rockefeller? No. Mrs. McCaskill? No. Mrs. Boxer? Mrs. Boxer? No. Mr. Durbin? Mr. Durbin? No. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island? No. Mr. Nelson? Mr. Nelson? No. Mr. Blunt? Aye. Mr. Cardin? Mr. Cardin? No. Mr. Alexander? Mr. Alexander? Aye. Mr. Bennett? Mr. Bennett? No. Mr. Barrasso? Mr. Barrasso? Aye. Mr. Menendez? No. Mr. Portman? Aye. Mr. Burr? Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. Coburn? Mr. Coburn, aye. Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Carper, no. Mr. Chambliss, aye. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Heinrich, no. Mr. Schumer, no. Ms. Landrieu, no. Mr. Udall of Colorado, no. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Pryor, aye. Ms. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Corker, aye.
So those two things working together.
Mr. Coons, no. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Reed of Nevada? No. Mr. King? No. Ms. Murkowski? No.